Welcome. My name is Serena Richardson, and I am your course facilitator for the introductory course. So the format of our video chat session will always be the same. I'm going to invite you to respond to a discussion opener question. And it will be a different one for each week, and it will typically be related to content from the previous week's module. Thank you for sharing that. We each bring to this conversation the information and knowledge and personal relationships and connections that we have, and maybe our passions for a particular refugee population, or maybe you're not aware of refugee populations. Maybe you're brand new to understanding the global context. And so Module 1 is giving you a picture of the global context. And so with that in mind, I want to move on to my presentation portion. Okay, so when we think about refugees in need, you have mentioned many countries, and some of you may be convinced that there are certain populations that are the most prominent and need them right now, and for a good reason. I want to give you some understanding about the situation globally that you may have recalled reading about or watching the videos about on Module 1. These are some of the refugee populations that UNHCR talks about, and they are certainly in crisis, as well as those who you have shared. Now, many of the populations that most people think about and talk about immediately come to mind simply because it's in newspapers, it's on television broadcast news reports and online media. Or they may come to mind for you because you have a personal connection or a personal passion or interest in supporting particular refugee populations. Now, I want to ask, what about Venezuelans? What do you know about the plight and needs of Venezuelans right now? They certainly are a refugee population in need. I want to talk about the global context. So currently on the UNHCR website, they have a page called Refugee Data Finder. And this is a page you want to check back in regularly to see what the actual needs are globally. And so to understand that global refugee crisis and to stay on top of rising needs, I encourage you to just simply do a Google search for UNHCR refugee statistics, and you'll come across these figures, which typically report on the previous year's global statistics reported by UNHCR. So, and as you can see here, by the end of 2024, 123.2 million people worldwide were forcibly displaced. And of those, 36.8 million are UNHCR mandated refugees. You might be surprised by this statistic. 69% originate from just 5 countries. Nearly 7 in 10 of all refugees under UNHCR's mandate and other people in need of international protection come from just 5 countries. And it's very important to recognize here that Venezuelan numbers are tracking at 6.2 million, which places them at the highest globally, followed by Syria, Afghanistan, Ukraine, and South Sudan. International support, however, of Venezuelans does not match that of other populations. And this is likely because the focus of international media is not equitable or fair. We did hear somebody mention about populations, other populations that have not gotten the focus of the media as well. So with this awareness now, perhaps when considering how to prioritize refugee populations in need, it's good to gain a broader understanding beyond what is prevalent in the media. When we understand the big picture about who is in need of resettlement, it helps to remember that we're comparing one vulnerable population to another vulnerable population. I recall one of you saying that people become refugees for a reason, because they have a need. So a good takeaway from this conversation today is to remember that while all refugees are in need of resettlement, Prioritization of who should be resettled first requires research apart from listening to prevailing media, because there are a lot of factors that come into play which don't make for great headlines. You'll recall from Module 1 that we talked about different types of people who are displaced. The first group of displaced persons are called refugees, and those are persons who have fled their country of origin, and they fear persecution or are fleeing war or human rights abuses, and they cannot return to their country of origin. They have received refugee status either from UNHCR or from the asylum country where they have fled. Then we have asylum seekers. These are persons who have also fled the country of origin to another country. They have registered with UNHCR or the asylum country, but they have not yet received their declaration of refugee status. This doesn't mean that they aren't refugees. It just means that they haven't received the official declaration by UNHCR or the asylum state yet, meaning they have not received their refugee status determination. And then we have the third type of displaced people, and these are persons called internally displaced persons, IDPs. And these are people who have not crossed a border to find safety. They may have fled their home, the town or village or city where they lived, but they have not left their country. Although they have not left their country, their plight may be just as dangerous, and they may be just as vulnerable as people who have crossed the border to another country. And it's important to note that internally displaced persons are not eligible to be sponsored under the private sponsorship of refugees program. Internally displaced persons stay within their own country and remain under the protection of its government, even if that government is the reason for their displacement. Unlike refugees, they are on the run at home, and these persons, unfortunately, cannot be brought to Canada. This is the 1951 Convention refugee definition. Now, I'm going to give you a little hint. I want you to do your best to memorize it, not word for word, but pick out some key words to help you remember this definition, because it's so important when determining if someone actually meets the Convention refugee criteria. In particular, since sponsorship agreement holders are not required to include the RSD document, knowing and applying the 1951 Geneva Convention will be important for their pre-screening and decision-making for which applications are eligible for submission. Now, a refugee is any person who has a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, or membership in a particular social group or political opinion, and they are outside their country of nationality and is unable or unwilling to seek the protection of that country, or does not have a nationality and is outside the country of their former habitual residence as a result of being persecuted and is unable or unwilling to return to their country. So again, this is a hint for you because it very likely may be the answer to a question on the final exam. So the refugee status determination, the RSD, this is the legal or administrative process by which either a government or the UNHCR determine whether a person seeking international protection, a person called an asylum seeker, is considered a refugee under international, regional, or national law. Unfortunately, in some countries, this process does not exist at all. So when we talk about refugee status determination, you should remember that either UNHCR or the country of asylum state could be making the refugee status determination decision. I would say that UNHCR ideally wants every state to make their own refugee status determinations. to follow the guidelines they provide and evaluate using the definition of a refugee, and to follow through on providing protection from refoulement and ensuring their basic needs are met. There are some countries, however, which don't have the structure, the legal framework to be able to provide that. And in these cases, UNHCR, if the country or state allows it, will be the body that makes the determination. Or in some countries, it will be a combination of the two. Canada makes its own refugee status determinations for asylum seekers who land at our borders. These persons are commonly known here as refugee claimants. These are persons who are already within Canada making a refugee claim, and they cannot be privately sponsored. When it comes to refugees abroad being sponsored, groups of 5 and community sponsors have to include an RSD document in order to be able to sponsor a refugee. And sponsorship agreement holders, however, do not require to submit the refugee status determination document. That's because they have a different agreement with the Government of Canada. But they still have to assess whether somebody meets the convention refugee definition. So refugee status is normally determined on an individual basis, either through an interview with UNHCR or with the government of the country of asylum. The issuing authority for the RSD differs in each country. Therefore, the RSD documents may look different as well. And refugee status is also issued on a prima facie basis in situations where mass displacement has occurred and the need to provide assistance is extremely urgent. So it may not be possible for purely practical reasons to carry out an individual determination of refugee status for each member of the displaced group. The Syrian refugee crisis is a good example of this. A blanket recognition or prima facie recognition was made when it was clear to the world that Syrians were exiting en masse by the thousands. Receiving prima facie recognition from UNHCR, however, does not mean that refugees will not have to go through Canada's screening process. Canada makes its own resettlement case decisions apart from UNHCR's recognition. UNHCR identifies 3 durable solutions that may exist for refugees. One is voluntary repatriation. This is the free and informed return of refugees to their country of origin in safety and dignity. The next is local integration. A refugee is considered locally integrated in the country of asylum if a number of conditions are met, including that they can move around that country freely. They are allowed to earn a living, their children are allowed to attend school, and there is no threat of forcible return to their country of origin. And resettlement to a third country other than Canada provides a durable solution for those who are particularly vulnerable and who are unable to benefit from the other 2 durable solutions. Now, resettlement is also a responsibility sharing mechanism and a way to address the rising global refugee crisis. So that is the end of my review of Module 1. I just want to go through the important dates you'll want to pay attention to. And keep in mind that this information is also found in the course syllabus. So the first 4 modules, quizzes, should be completed no later than the 5th of October. And then we'll review those quizzes on the 8th of October. Then modules 5 through 8 quizzes should be completed by the 2nd of November. And the review for those quizzes will take place on the 5th of November. The final exam will be due on the 9th of November. And the review of the final exam is on November 12th. Keep in mind that the review webinars are completely optional. However, if you do want to see where you may have gotten some incorrect answers on either the quizzes or the final exam, you're welcome to join us. You will just need to register for those webinars, and the registration links are in the course under the Start Here tile. Exactly, yes. They're still considered internally displaced, unfortunately. That is Canada's criteria, is that they actually have to leave that country of origin. Yeah, you are commenting on the plight of Venezuelans, yes, that you hadn't heard about it and not in the media at least. Yes, not surprising. There are some populations that get ignored for whatever reason. And unfortunately, the only way we hear about them is when we share and talk about the context that we understand about people who are in need. And at times it can be very overwhelming. There are so many needs in the world and they just keep increasing. I remember that when I was first beginning this role as a trainer, the statistics I was sharing from the UNHCR website were lower. And at that time, I thought they were high. So wars continue. People continue to flee because of being targeted personally for persecution, as is the case for convention refugees. So there is international agreement through those who have signed the 1951 Geneva Convention and its 1967 protocol, saying that they will offer protection to those who have fled war and violence and personal persecution. However, the world is changing, as somebody commented during our discussion. More and more countries are closing or reducing their immigration numbers, and Canada is one of them, which is very discouraging because we are a country that has always been a leader in demonstrating how we can share the burden with those countries who often get the bulk of refugee migration. Sadly, for those who may not be aware, one of the limitations Canada put out there in the beginning of 2025 is that groups of 5 and community sponsor opportunities have been paused. And so that's made it a challenge for people who want to sponsor their relatives, and they have gathered together a group of 5 people who are willing to assist them with the sponsorship. But the government of Canada has said you can't submit applications right now. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because a backlog of applications was formed primarily because of COVID, when intake of applications kept coming in, but resettlement decisions were not made. And so that backlog got up to an extremely high number. I can't remember the final number, but I remember that they were saying 75,000 were in the queue that hadn't even been looked at to see if they contained the refugee sponsorship determination. So that was discouraging. They made the hard decision to pause the program so that they could catch up and get through the backlog. And realistically, it didn't matter if they decided to pause it or not, because the backlogs were causing refugees to be waiting for a decision for 4 years or more. And so whether you wait 4 years for, the application backlog and queue to get your application to the top, or whether, the program is paused for a year, the end result is the same. Refugees' lives are being impacted because of these delays or the backlogs. So if you haven't realized it by now, private sponsorship of refugees is not a fast solution for urgent needs. So we heard somebody talk about, impending deportation. That's a scary thing to experience, being forced back to the country where you fear persecution or war. It truly is a life and death situation. And so we need to manage expectations of those that we're offering to submit application for, so that they know that submitting an application can take years. And it's not going to be the solution that they need if they're facing impending deportation. So with that, I think we'll call a close to our time together tonight. I thank you, everybody, for joining us. If you have any questions about the course, if you have any challenges or difficulties and need help, feel free to contact me by email. In your course, you should see a button on the top right-hand side. You click that and it should open your email up. you can email me at etraining@rstp.ca. Typically Mondays through Friday during business hours. I will respond generally between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. Eastern within a 24-hour period of receiving your question.